Ladies and gentlemen, the Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia, and the Subcommittee on Europe will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to discuss Iran and Russia's cooperation to enhance their shared malign intent, including Iran's sale of drones and other weapons to war criminal Putin, Russia's use of its UN Security Council veto to benefit Iran, sanctions evasion schemes to benefit both countries, and nuclear collaboration, a danger to the whole world. I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Murphy, be allowed to sit at the dais and participate following all other members in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. And as I do, I would like to remind the audience members that disruption of committee proceedings is against the law. Holding up of signs or making verbal outbursts during the proceedings is disruptive and will not be tolerated in the interests of free speech for everyone. Any disruptions will result in a suspension of the proceedings until the Capitol Police can restore order. I am grateful to co-chair this joint committee hearing with the chairman of the Europe Subcommittee, the very capable Tom Keene of New Jersey. Thank you for being here for what is sadly a critical and timely hearing to examine the partnership of evil opportunity between war criminal Putin and the regime in Tehran. This weekend, the world watched in horror as Iranian regime directly and with puppets attacked Israel with over 300 drones and missiles, including ballistic missiles. The same long-range Shahed drones launched by the Iranian regime to attack Israel are used every day by war criminal Putin to murder innocent civilians. And we saw another attack today, which was inconceivable on an apartment complex, clearly a civilian target in Ukraine. And then we will see too, sadly, Dr. McCormick notices we'll see a later attack on the EMS personnel and the first responders, police, fire. And so the Putin strategy is clear: to kill civilians, to intimidate civilians, and then intimidate first responders. Russia and Iran will soon be jointly producing deadly suicide drones in Moscow. Iranian regime officials are on the ground in Belarus and occupied Ukraine at the request of war criminal Putin. This murderous partnership of opportunity was cemented following Russian and Iranian intervention murderously in Syria, supporting the campaign of mass murderer Bashar al-Assad against the Syrian People's Revolution, against the criminal Assad regime. The unholy alliance between war criminal Putin and the terrorist regime in Tehran has flourished in Syria, with war criminal Putin establishing a footprint on the Mediterranean through his puppet Bashar al-Assad. Iranian terrorist puppets and Putin's thugs in Syria are free to use Syria as a weapons depot and staging area to launch missiles and drones, including against our own service members. The dictators in Moscow, Tehran, and Beijing have conducted joint maritime exercises for years. Our adversaries are playing a long game. War criminal Putin has already signed an agreement to purchase Iranian ballistic missiles in violation of the sanctions, including those encountering America's adversaries through Sanctions Act. Disturbingly and sadly, the Biden administration renewed waivers to allow for Russo-Iranian collaboration to facilitate the expansion of Iranian regime nuclear aspirations, with technical support for Putin through these Russian-owned Rosatom, potentially yielding a $10 billion windfall for Putin as he carries out war crimes in Syria and Ukraine with the backing from the Iranian regime. I'm grateful to support the strong efforts and effective efforts of Chairman Tom Kean to stop this insanity. As we know, sanctions are only as strong as their enforcement, and diplomacy is only possible where leverage exists. Sadly, this administration seems intent on ceding our leverage as adversaries strengthen cooperation to undermine American interests. Collaboration between the two regimes extends far beyond weapons. They work together to evade sanctions and are actively building supply routes to facilitate transfer of weapons and solidify their commitment to integrate energy projects to undermine democracies. Both carry water for each other at the United Nations, where the dictators run the show, and Russia weaponizes its veto at the United Nations Security Council to provide cover for other dictators. Both Iran and Russia abuse financial systems to evade our sanctions. The number one goal of the Iranian regime is ultimately a nuclear weapon to fulfill its stated goal. In English, they're very clear to tell the world, death to America, death to Israel. War criminal Putin is more than happy to help the mullahs reach this goal. Russia has launched Iranian satellites into orbit and actively provides technical support to the Iranian regime, quote, space program, and it extends its reach into Ukraine. The partnership between war criminal Putin and the regime in Tehran extends to and is aided by support from the Chinese Communist Party, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, and mass murderer Bashar al-Assad. The defense of American interests against our adversaries is not a partisan issue. Sadly, the Biden administration repeatedly fails to enforce sanctions and make concessions, replacing real deterrence with diplomacy out of fear of escalation. History has consistently shown that escalation occurs when America operates from a position of weakness. Following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by war criminal Putin, Ukraine effectively mobilized and has done what many said could not be done. They have resisted. They have imposed massive costs on the Putin regime. They've liberated thousands of square miles of their country. War criminal Putin's ability to murder innocent Ukrainians and threaten our allies with invasion is directly supported and aided by the Iranian regime. War criminal Putin's first trip abroad following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine was to Tehran. In March 2023, prior to the horrific murderous attack of October 7th in Israel, war criminal Putin welcomed Hamas leaders to Moscow and has since welcomed them back. It would not be a stretch to say that the Iranian regime is now a full participant in war criminal Putin's delusional attempt to recreate the Soviet empire, as they too have an expansionist goal. Both Putin and the Ayatollah like Xi seek a new multipolar world order at the expense of freedom and democracy. Iranian regime officials are on the ground to temporarily occupy regions of Ukraine, and there is full information sharing with Moscow. Those who support Israel and its right to self-defense should also support the right of Ukraine to do the same thing. The adversary is the same. We should be consistent supporting the borders of Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and America. We are in a conflict we did not choose, of dictators with rule of gun invading democracies with rule of law. I appreciate our esteemed witnesses, including Behnam Ben Taleblu and Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and we also have Gabriel Noronha, a Fellow at the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. And finally, we have Dana Stroul, the Research Director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I now gladly yield to the Ranking Member Bill Keating for his opening statement. Again, I'd like to state it's substantially, almost universally bipartisan, particularly as I look out and I see our members of the other party from North Carolina and a remote area called Rhode Island. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chairman Wilson, Chairman Kane, and our witnesses for being here today to discuss the deepening Russian-Iranian relationship and how the U.S. and our allies can work together to counter this authoritarian alliance. While we face many threats and much instability around the world today, Russia and Iran sit at the heart of resistance against the United States, the West, and the tenets of democracy and the rule of law. Just this weekend, Iran launched an unprecedented drone and missile attack against the state of Israel. Israel is America's closest ally in the Middle East and the only democracy in the region. The devastating October 7th terrorist attack against Israel, perpetrated by Hamas, an Iranian-backed terrorist group, and the most recent Iranian attacks seek to undermine Israel's very existence. This must not stand, and I commend the Biden administration, the United Kingdom, France, Jordan, and our allies and partners for coming together to Israel's defense. Threats from Iran are not just limited to Israel. On January 28th, Iranian-backed Iraq Shia militia groups attacked Tower 22, a U.S. base in Jordan. One of the more 170 such attacks, killing 3 U.S. service members. At the same time, Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen have launched over 70 attacks on U.S. and commercial vessels in the Red Sea, threatening global shipping and freedom of navigation. While Iran undermines U.S. interests in regional stability, Russia continues its brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. Vladimir Putin has further tightened their authoritarian grip on power by imprisoning opposition figures, targeting innocent Americans in Russia, among them Paul Whelan and Emin Gorshovich, and expanding their economic and military relationship with other U.S. adversaries like China and North Korea. In the Middle East, Russia has historically aimed to have a multifaceted foreign policy, carefully seeking to balance relationship with Iran, the Gulf, and Israel. However, to support its war in Ukraine, Russia has turned resolutely towards Tehran, purchasing thousands of Iranian drones to be used against Ukrainian targets and working with Iran to evade sanctions in response to its invasion. Iranian drones used by Russia and Ukraine provide Tehran with important battlefield testing for its weapons, likely informing Iran's own usage of these drones. To counter Iran's malign influence, Russia's authoritarian ambitions in Ukraine and the expanding Russian-Iranian relationship, the Biden administration has taken action marshaling the support of 51 allies and partners for our ally Ukraine, creating a coalition of partners to ensure freedom of navigation in the Red Sea, striking Houthi rebels who attack U.S. interests, and imposing comprehensive sanctions in response to Russian-Iranian military cooperation in Ukraine, as well as new sanctions announced yesterday in response to Iran's attack against Israel. In Congress, I've introduced legislation on this very issue with Chairman Wilson. The block the use of transatlantic technology in Iranian Drones Act, which has been reported out of this committee favorably. It still requires the Department of State, Commerce, and Defense to develop strategies to counter the use of Western and U.S. technology in Iranian drones. I'm hopeful this legislation will be voted on the floor as soon as possible. The most urgent measure we as Congress can take is to vote on the Senate-passed National Security Supplemental Bill, which passed by a vote of 70 to 29, a strong bipartisan vote. This legislation will ensure Ukraine has the necessary military, financial, and humanitarian support to defeat Russia on the battlefield and ensure its economy remains solvent. The bill provides urgent military assistance to Israel, as well as humanitarian support for Palestinian civilians, many of whom are on the brink of famine. Put simply, this bill addresses threats to the United States' national security across the world, bolsters our allies' defenses, hurts our adversaries' ability to spread malign influence, and even creates jobs and investments right here at home. Finally, the supplemental package sends an unmistakable message to allies and partners around the world that an investment in America is an investment in global stability. It's a signal to Russia and Iran, as well as China and North Korea, that their malfeasance and aggression on the world stage, as well as their burgeoning partnerships, will not be left unaddressed. If Russia sees its attacks on Ukraine go unanswered, and if Iran believes its proxies can act unchallenged in the Middle East without a U.S. response, the Russian-Iranian partnership will grow and it will strengthen. In closing, as many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have said, we must pass this supplemental package immediately. Breaking up this package from what has been passed by the Senate creates unnecessary delay and uncertainty over whether the U.S. will answer the call for a Churchillian response for the defense of democracy or a Chamberlain response of appeasement. While we should work for any successful resolution, if this legislation stalls or is ineffective, we should sign the discharge petition and bring forth the Senate bipartisan bill to the floor as soon as possible. This is a moment. This is an historical moment, and it's a moment of urgency, and I hope that we can act on this bipartisan package coming from the Senate. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Bill Keating, and I particularly want to thank you for referencing the January 28th that 3 young Americans who were reservists, Army reservists from Georgia, were killed by Hezbollah as puppets of Iran. And this should never be forgotten. And I just appreciate so much you referencing that. And with this, I'd like to now proceed to the Chairman of the Subcommittee on Europe, Congressman Tom Keene, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for your extraordinary leadership and long-standing leadership on this issue, and the importance of pulling this both committees together on this important day, on this important topic. I also want to thank Ranking Member Keating for his strong partnership over the last year and a half on issues of strong importance on European growth and making sure we defend Ukraine against Russian aggression. Unlike any other time in recent memory, our world is on fire. With multiple conflicts in different regions, the enemies of freedom are emboldened like never before. At the helm of this chaos are 2 fierce enemies of freedom and Democracy, the Russian Federation, and the Islamic Republic of Iran. But this vile alliance did not happen overnight. Building upon years of coordination in Syria, Russia has leveraged the military and political exchanges with Tehran during the Syrian civil war to its benefit. What has now emerged is a full-fledged, mutually beneficial defense partnership made more complete by Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. Since the first year of the war, Iranian Shahed drones have been procured and used by the Russian Federation to kill civilians and to target critical infrastructure. Last month, our subcommittee's hearing on Rosatom highlighted the role that Russia's nuclear energy sector plays in building Iran's nuclear program. David Albright, the president of the Institute for Science and International Security, testified that Rosatom, Russia's nuclear energy monopoly, is involved in providing carbon fiber used for making these Shahed drones, and that manufacturing is occurring in Russia. In Belarus and occupied Crimea, Tehran was more than willing to send military advisors to help train Russian forces on how to operate the Shahed drone. They've also been more than willing to lend expertise and to develop clandestine financial systems to help Russia evade sanctions, something that Iran, unfortunately, has much experience in. In return, Russia has committed to sell Iran advanced weapon systems such as the Su-35 fighter jet and the S-400 air defense system. Though Rosatom Russia is actively supporting the expansion of Iran's nuclear program, including its secretive underground enrichment facility, the Fordow fuel enrichment plant. Of course, Rosatom's activities in Iran would not be possible without the Biden administration's use of sanctions waivers under the Iran Freedom and Counter-Proliferation Act. It is this foolish approach over the last 3 years that has enabled and emboldened closer cooperation between both countries. Iran is openly threatening to sell advanced ballistic missiles to Russia. In fact, Iran has already reportedly provided Russia with approximately 400 ballistic missiles. The same ballistic missiles used to rain hellfire on the people of Israel over the weekend can and will be used to threaten NATO and to kill Ukrainian civilians. Last week's attacks also highlight Iran's willingness to use strike packages modeled on those the Russians have repeatedly used against Ukraine. They are sharing battlefield lessons with each other to better threaten America and our allies. Emboldened like never before, Iran and its proxies literally want to wipe Israel from the face of the earth, while Russian forces try to do this on a daily basis in Ukraine. The threats posed by Russia and Iran are interconnected. They are working towards the same goal: the destruction of American allies and the demise of transatlantic leadership and deterrence. Let me be clear. Deterrence failed because the Biden administration failed to project strength. President Biden will fail to effectively counter this threat if he tries to dictate to Ukraine how they are to fight Russia, and if he continues down the path of undermining the U.S.-Israel alliance. The Biden administration must lead by example and coalesce our transatlantic allies to meaningfully address this interconnected threat. The sooner that this administration and our friends in Europe see the Russia-Iran threat as one and the same, the closer we will be to finally turning the tide against this vile alliance. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Chairman Tom Kean, and thank you for your insight and your success on raising these issues. We are pleased to have with us the distinguished witnesses, Mr. Behnam Ben Taleblu, the Senior Fellow of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Mr. Gabriel Noronha, the Fellow with the Jewish Institute for the National Security of America, and Dana L. Stroul, the Research Director with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. We thank all of you for being here today. Your full statement will be made part of the record, and I'll ask you to keep spoken remarks to 5 minutes so that we can allow time for member questions. And Alexis is going to be the monitor of the 5 minutes, so watch her hand signals. And I now recognize Ben Taleblu for opening statement.
Chairman, ranking members, distinguished members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee's Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia Subcommittee and Europe Subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. It is a privilege to present my analysis alongside Gabriel Noronha and Dana Stroul, both of whom have served in the U.S. government and have since contributed to bettering our public national security debate. Ladies and gentlemen, it's high time to connect the dots. America's authoritarian adversaries like Russia and Iran are drawing closer together, constituting a new revisionist axis capable of supporting one another's foreign and security policies while undermining ours and those of our allies. There may be no cruder example of this than the praise Russian President Putin just offered Iranian President Raisi for Iran's missile and drone attack on Israel, calling it, quote, the best way to punish the aggressor and a manifestation of the tact and rationality of Iran's leaders, end quote. But Iran and Russia are not natural allies. In fact, they have centuries of historic enmity. In my written testimony, I trace in depth the turbulent, then transactional, and now transformational phases of their relationship, the latter of which we are now in. This has been evidenced by Iran's provision of one-way attack drones, unmanned combat aerial vehicles, artillery shells, and even body armor to Russia since 2022 to support Putin's war in Ukraine. In return, the Islamic Republic has received gold, cash, Russian diplomatic cover, captured Western weapons, and contracts for advanced Russian platforms like the Su-35. Washington has warned that Tehran may also provide Moscow with short-range ballistic missiles. Last year, in a historic first, Iran participated in Russia's Army 2023 military exposition in August, showcasing a mock-up of the Ababil close-range ballistic missile. Please see Image 1. One month later, in September, Russia's defense minister visited an IRGC Aerospace Force exhibition in Tehran, where he inspected, among other things, the full Ababil missile. Please see Image 2. Iranian ballistic missiles would significantly alter the threat landscape in Ukraine by helping Russia conserve its own ballistic missiles and offer more opportunities for layered attacks. Ukraine also has comparatively less in the way of expensive ballistic missile defenses than it does air defenses. Looking ahead, Iran and Russia could easily deepen their relationships, be it in nuclear matters, sanctions busting, the cyber domain, or evicting the U.S. from Syria. In my testimony, I outlined several such areas, but here today I am choosing to ring the alarm bell over space and satellite cooperation. There is significant concern that Russia may be helping Iran launch spy satellites for military purposes that could make Iranian ballistic missiles more accurate. Late last year, in fact, a video emerged from summer 2019 showing IRGC Aerospace Force commander and his Russian counterpart in Tehran shaking hands after Iran proposed to Russia to create a drone command if Russia helped Iran create a space command. Please see Image 3. Congress can help offset this deepening cooperation by weakening each party. For example, 1. Through legislation, Congress has already set the stage for a better Iran policy that provides more options to deal with Iran's domestic suppression and foreign aggression. The Massa Act, the SHIP Act, and the Fight Crime Act are good examples. 2. Through oversight, Congress should inquire about the status and implementation of the Defend Act, which calls for establishing an integrated air and missile defense architecture in the Middle East. It should also inquire about the status of the task force the Biden administration claimed to create last year to combat Iran's acquisition of Western components for Iranian drones, which have ended up in Ukraine. 3. Through creativity, by considering the applicability of Iran sanctions and even terrorism sanctions to Russian targets, as well as the exposure of Iranian entities to existing Russian sanctions. A priority for Washington will be how best to target Russia and Iran's Caspian Sea-based sanctions busting. 4, through the bully pulpit, Congress should ring the alarm bell on both Russia and Iran's deepening ties with another party, China, as well as their repression of dissidents and protesters at home. 5, through pressure, Congress should press the administration to work with the E3 to snap back and restore UN sanctions on Iran before this option expires in 2025 October. Should this lapse, the West will not be able to use the UN Security Council to bring diplomatic pressure against Iran again, as Russia is poised to play the role of Iran's lawyer for the foreseeable future at international organizations. And 6, through financing. By passing the supplemental, Congress can make sure that our partners, which have been subject to attacks and predation by Putin's Russia and Khamenei's Iran, have the means to defend themselves. In my written testimony, I have offered additional policy recommendations aimed at tackling this rising relationship. Thank you for your time, attention, and the opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ben Taleblu. And we now recognize Mr. Noronha for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman, ranking members, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for having me testify today. The West is under a joint assault from Iranian and Russian drones, missiles, and nuclear threats. And I think it's important to note that the same weapons fired at Israel this past weekend have been hurled at Ukraine for over 2 years now. We cannot hope to counter one threat and ignore the other. And I want to compliment this committee in particular for already working on some of those solutions. I'll offer a few new ones right here that haven't been legislated on yet. One of the most immediate developments that we must disrupt is increased Russian and Iranian weapons and munitions production that today will help Russia overwhelm Ukraine, but tomorrow could help Iran overwhelm Israel. Iran has built a joint drone production facility east of Moscow. 90% of those electrical and computer components are planned to be sourced from the United States, according to their own documents, 90%. A few solutions. First, Congress should require the manufacturers, the U.S. manufacturers of those components to verify their end destination if they are going to be exporting from the United States. We should outright prohibit all sales of these components to Turkey, the UAE, China, and Hong Kong, since they are major proliferation hubs to Russia and Iran. Second, we need all our allies to match our counter-proliferation sanctions. It's an inconvenience to be blocked from just the United States. But if you and your family are going to be banned from entering Europe or any of our Asian allied countries, you're going to think twice about getting involved in this kind of trade. Third, we should punish the companies moving weapons from Iran to Russia. Iranian state airlines ferry many of the suicide drones, the military personnel, and other weapons to Russia. These terror airlines are already on the brink of bankruptcy, and we can push them over the edge. According to my research, these airlines are still today landing in over a dozen airports in NATO countries, even though they are sanctioned by the United States for terrorism and WMD proliferation. The airlines get hundreds of millions of dollars for these commercial flights to Europe. European governments are aware of this, and they've chosen not to crack down. I'd like to submit my report on this issue for the record, if I may. We must be willing to enforce our sanctions.
Shall be admitted.
We must be willing to enforce our sanctions on any airport that hosts these terror airlines, or the sanctions we have on the books already don't mean anything at all. Europe also hosts 15 Iranian state-owned banks sanctioned by the United States for terrorism and WMD proliferation. Those could be shut down tomorrow, and their assets sent to Ukraine for war reparations. Europe has refused to do this as well. If I may be frank, Congress needs to deal with a painful truth, which is that our European allies have thwarted nearly every effort to hold the Iranian regime accountable for their deadly work in Ukraine. In fact, senior European leaders often even embolden Iranian actions. This behavior is untenable, especially as Europe keeps asking Americans to help thwart an invasion powered by Iranian weapons. What is good for Russia is good for Iran. What is good for Iran is good for Russia. Europe likes to ignore that latter point. Europe and the Biden administration must also snap back the UN sanctions that, until they let expire last October, blocked, under international law, Iranian shipments of ammunition, drones, and ballistic missiles to Russia. As my colleague Behnam mentioned, we can restore these sanctions in under 30 days without the approval of Russia or China. And especially in light of Iran's brazen attack on Israel, this should be our minimum response. And we have to use this snapback soon. The tool will expire exactly 18 months from this evening. At that point, realistically, we are never getting UN sanctions back on Iran. On the nuclear file, Iranian and Russian nuclear cooperation is deeper than most people realize. My written testimony documents that there are now around 5,000 Russian nuclear personnel working inside Iran. The regime has also been asking Russia for help acquiring additional nuclear materials that could shorten its nuclear breakout time. Yet, the State Department has been rewarding this cooperation with sanctions waivers. and I want to agree fully with the letters signed by Chairman Keane and Wilson today. Those waivers helped Russia through its state-owned nuclear company Rosatom on their ongoing construction of 2 new nuclear reactors for Iran. Without those waivers, Rosatom could not receive payment for their work in Iran. And Rosatom's future work in Iran could earn them upwards of $50 billion this decade. Rosatom is instrumental to Russia's assault on Ukraine. As this committee has heard recently, we need to bankrupt Rosatom. I offer my thoughts on how to do this, how to bankrupt some of their oil sales, and several more specific ideas of how to weaken the 2 regimes in my full written testimony. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Noronha, thank you so much. And I want to give you some good news, and that is that everyone here voted yesterday for a legislation called No Technology for Terror, right in line with the concerns you expressed. And it was presciently offered by Congressman Nathaniel Moran of Texas. And so with good suggestions, I'm really grateful that we have members of Congress who, vast majority, will be very happy to work with the 3 of you. And Ms. Stroul, for your opening statement.
Chairman Wilson and Keene, Ranking Member Keating, and honorable members of the subcommittees, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on this critical issue. 2 observations up front. Policymakers and analysts have long insisted that the relationship between Moscow and Tehran would never rise beyond the tactical due to long-standing historical animosity and ideological differences. Today, that view no longer holds water. The geopolitical landscape incentivizes both governments to strengthen a strategic alliance. Secondly, there has long been an assumption that Russia is the dominant player in this bilateral relationship and can be relied upon to moderate Iran's actions. Today, the balance of leverage has shifted. Russia's reliance on Iranian weapons to sustain its war in Ukraine means that Iran has the upper hand. This cooperation has implications in the following areas: military coordination. Citizens in Ukraine and citizens in the Middle East are suffering from the same Iranian weapons. Russia's willingness to provide Iran advanced fighter aircraft, upgraded air defense capabilities, and other military technology poses a serious risk to the balance of power in the Middle East. Russia and Iran are using Ukraine and the Middle East as a battlefield lab to improve their weapons and develop techniques to overcome U.S. and allied capabilities. This has implications for the security of U.S. origin defense equipment, and as they learn lessons about U.S. and NATO air defenses, those vulnerabilities will be transferred to other adversaries developing their own plans for future wars. It means our military planners need to update war plans, and that we need to reassess our own defense sales and arms sales so that the balance of power remains in our favor. Nuclear nonproliferation. We should expect that Russia will block U.S. and European efforts to constrain and walk back Iran's steps toward its own nuclear threshold status. Sanctions. As the 2 most sanctioned countries in the world, Tehran and Moscow are actively engaged in activities to circumvent, evade, and weaken the potency of our sanctions. Diplomacy. Russia is using its seat at the UN Security Council and other international bodies like the IAEA to shield Iran from accountability for its actions. And domestic suppression. Iran and Russia are exchanging best practices to crush protests, undermine citizen organization efforts, and maintain mass surveillance programs against their own people. This cooperation challenges values that we have long held as critical for global stability, human rights, representative governance, and transparency. Moreover, they are working to undermine democratic processes through election interference and disinformation, including here in the United States. Iran's complex state-on-state attack against Israel on April 13th bears the hallmarks of Russian attacks on Ukraine. Iran enables Russia to continue its war, including the deliberate targeting of Ukrainian civilians. Iran is extracting from Russia lessons in combined strike packages, how to improve the lethality of their weapons, and how to overcome Western air defenses. While there is debate here about security assistance to Ukraine, there is no hesitation by Tehran to continue supporting Russia. Though Iran's attack against Israel failed this weekend, we should expect that Moscow and Tehran will improve military operations against Ukraine, Israel, and others in the Middle East going forward. Future attacks will be more lethal. To counter this cooperation, we can take the following steps. Continue sanctions enforcement and expand sanctions. Russia will not be able to maintain payment schedules and provide Tehran and other owners of Russian-origin military equipment with spare parts. Now we need to expand it and coordinate with European partners. Engage the private sector. U.S. and Western parts are ending up in Iranian-manufactured attack drones. We need more education and outreach to help ensure compliance with sanctions and raise awareness of customers seeking to acquire off-the-shelf commercial dual-use products for lethal purposes. Continue downgrading intelligence to expose this malign Iranian-Russian cooperation. It underscores America's value as a reliable actor committed to defending the sovereignty and security of our partners. Increase public diplomacy to counter Iranian and Russian misinformation, and maintain programs that seek to reach civil society in Iran and Russia, drawing a distinction between the regimes and the leadership and the people of these countries. And emphasize the benefits of U.S. partnership and coalitions. The performance of European and Arab partners working together to disrupt Iran's attack this weekend is the clearest proof of concept that we should be the partner of choice for countries who benefit from the current international order. We are the only military capable of operationally integrating our partners, informed by unparalleled intelligence and unmatched technology. One final remark, the most immediate action we can take is to pass the National Security Supplemental. This will allow critical security funding and defense equipment to flow to Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan, the partners most at risk from adversary actions. But it also supports our military, diplomats, and assistance specialists working 24/7. We cannot underestimate the strategic significance of passing the supplemental. It will immediately be understood in the hallways of Tehran, Moscow, and Beijing, and will provide reassurance not only to our partners in the most need, but to other skeptical partners questioning U.S. staying power. The funding for defense industry expansion in the supplemental will make the United States a more reliable partner. This is not only about Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan. It is about the ecosystem of allies and partners that we want to work with and are looking to us for leadership, as well as to our defense industry and our cutting-edge technology and innovation. This is about our reliability as a guarantor of the current international order, and that we are ready to walk and not only talk, and standing up for the defense of our partners. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Stroul. And I now recognize myself for 5 minutes, and Alexis is going to be very firm in raising that issue on the 5 minutes. And as we begin, I'd like to reiterate bipartisanship. Last night, I was grateful to be with Ranking Member Keating, meeting with the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, a great member of NATO, a former member of the Warsaw Pact. How times can change. But we were with Peter Fiala, the Prime Minister, and to see their assistance to Ukraine per GDP, they provide more assistance to Ukraine than the United States. And so it's just reassuring to see bipartisanship and see our allies and see NATO more unified than ever with, hey, who would ever imagine Sweden, 200 years of neutrality given up, and now Putin has what he said he didn't want to have, 830-mile border with NATO and Finland. With that in mind, I want to thank Mr. Taleblu so much connecting the dots. An organization, the AEI, has provided connecting the dots, and I hope people see the interconnection, which is so clear between American Enterprise Institute, so clear between the axis of evil of war criminal Putin, the Chinese Communist Party, and the regime in Tehran, and it just can't be missed. And then the pictures you showed of the delegations with the weaponry, we've seen that over and over again. Our enemies are very happy to show how well they work together. I still remember the pictures of the Iranians with the Houthis showing off their phenomenal capability of UAVs and drones. And so we need to understand that. Mr. Taleblu, in your monograph, which everyone should read, you detail the expansion of Iran's ballistic military missile program. And earlier this year, the CIA director warned about Russian assistance to the regime in Tehran with the space and missile program, and also now we see the nuclear program, of course. And so what might this look like, and how can we address this?
Thank you, sir, and also thank you for your leadership in connecting the dots legislatively on another partner in that axis, which is the Syrian regime. So thank you for your leadership on countering that threat as well. That was really the laboratory for Iran and Russia pre-Ukraine. To your question about the cooperation on Iran and Russia in the missile and space world, I think there's three we have to be aware of: satellites, space launch vehicles, and potentially GPS. Satellites. Russia actually helped Iran launch its first satellite ever in 2005. They put it into a Russian carrier rocket, and the Russians launched it allegedly into low Earth orbit. Since then, the Russians have been actively involved in helping the Iranians actively place smaller satellites, telecommunication, imagery, messaging, back and forth into low Earth orbit, allegedly. The fear here is that the more you have a series of Iranian satellites operating there, the better the targeting can be for Iranian weapons, which even at least prior to the strike on Israel had been improving. The second is space launch vehicles. In this sense, Iran is walking and chewing gum at the same time. It is developing active, solid, and liquid propellant 2-stage and 3-stage carrier rockets that could potentially become the bedrock for a future ICBM program. This also allows Iran to claim to adhere to a self-imposed 2,000-kilometer cap while working on developing something that can threaten Europe and then threaten us. Iran has not perfected this, and the fear here is, a la the CIA director, that the Russians could help them with staging, thrust, and perhaps most importantly, going from SLV to ICBM, the reentry vehicle technology. Lastly is the satellites. Is the GPS, essentially. Russia has its own version of GPS called GLONASS. Iran, since 2014, has been trying to create a more localized version, not global, but local positioning system called Huda. It's unclear how successful this is, but this is a sign that both of our adversaries are trying to hedge away from technologies that we can control to be in full charge of their own precision strike capability.
Thank you for raising that, because they've already got the ballistic missile capability to strike Greece, Bulgaria, India, and so this is so serious and must be addressed. And Mr. Noronha, the illegal aggression of Putin and Ukraine, how has that affected their ability to help Bashar al-Assad?
Massively, because it has taken so much of the allied effort off of the Bashar al-Assad regime. Our Middle Eastern partners are also lifting their prohibitions against dealing with Assad for a number of reasons, but partly, again, the West has taken its eye off of Syria. We aren't putting pressure on. And one thing that I've noticed, particularly in recently, is there's this focus on saying, the deaths of Palestinians, all of which are tragic, in a complete ignorance of the fact that Assad was brutally massacring 10,000 Palestinians, even more, in Syria, and has gotten really no approbation for that.
Thank you for raising that to our attention. Now, Ranking Member Bill Keating.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. While in the period where this hearing started and the President, I received news that President Biden has announced his official support for the House bills and called for their passage. In this extraordinary effort of bipartisanship by the President, I hope that if we do have delays here in the House, and as the terrain hardens and the mud season ends in Ukraine and the threat of greater attack on the ground by Russia becomes graver, I hope that if there's a delay in this, that my Republican colleagues will move on a discharge and sign the discharge petition if indeed there's a dilatory attempts to stop this type of funding that we now have the House leadership and the President and the Senate all in accord with. So I hope that efforts to do that, because this moment is a perilous moment for Ukraine right now. And soldiers are dying unnecessarily because they don't have the basic munitions to go forward and defend themselves. With that being said, I just want to ask a question in that regard. The supplemental funding package request strengthens our alliances, not just in Europe, and not just with European countries, but also strengthens our posture in the Middle East as well. So if indeed, this Congress does not act, this House does not act, or delays in acting during this period of this week, what vital and life-saving assistance, being denied by Ukraine, what message does that send to the Middle East and what's going on there, let alone China? Anyone can jump aboard if they want.
If I may, one lesson that we learned is Russia involved itself in Syria and got massive bases, 105 bases in Syria as a result. Iran has now supplied massive weapons to Russia. It is not inconceivable that should Ukraine be forced into surrender, that we will see Iranian military bases on the European continent. Those bases would be 2,000 kilometers closer to New York City and Washington, D.C. if they ever choose to launch nuclear-armed missiles at us. That is something that the House should take into serious consideration.
Yeah, I just want to shift quickly to another important issue that Ms. Stroul brought forward that's not been given enough attention, although the Senate Intelligence Committee is about to move forward with further hearings, I believe, on this issue. And that's something they worked with in 2020 in terms of election interference and disinformation. Ms. Stroul, how important and what a great threat that presents going forward to this period of time during an election year. Can you expand on your comments about and your concerns on that kind of election interference as well?
Thank you for the question. Russia and Iran are clearly working together on a playbook to undermine democracies and representative governments. They learned valuable lessons about how to stoke political discourse and spread lies and information in 2020. We know that they've continued to do it here in the United States and that they're gearing up to do more of it. Two, Iran has been successful in undermining electoral processes in other countries. A good example is Iraq, where Iranian influence, meddling, payment to political parties, pressuring of politicians absolutely shifted the political discourse and parties during a government formation period that resulted in the longest government formation period in the history of Iraq. There's no question that they are exchanging information about these tactics and techniques and preparing to foment discord and division because they see a weak and divided America as better for their alliance and to be deflecting from what they are doing in both Europe and the Middle East.
Yeah, it's an important point that you brought forward because, you look at so many factors. You look at the Wagner Group, for instance, reports that they were giving weapons to Hezbollah as well. So you see this kind of military coordination that's occurring. But I think your point in terms of the hybrid warfare that Russia uses is also being used by Iran during this period. And as we gather for this hearing and look at that kind of coordination between Moscow and Tehran, we can't forget all the aspects of hybrid warfare that they're doing. I really appreciate you bringing that point, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Bill Keating. We now proceed to Chairman Tom Kean of New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the coming days, the EU will propose new sanctions against Iran after the regime launched over 200 drones and ballistic missiles towards Israel. The EU is looking to expand sanctions imposed on Iran for supplying Russia with drones and missiles to possibly include components. Would you consider, this is for Mr. Noronha, would you consider this a significant consequence given Iran's actions before and after October 7th, 2023?
It entirely depends on the nature of these sanctions. My guess is that no, they will not be very serious. The regime in Iran will not take this as a significant escalation unless they do the UN snapback of sanctions. That is significant. That would impose real costs. Anything short of that is a little window dressing, in my view.
So do you agree with that, Mr. Taleblu?
Partially. Here's why. On October 18, 2023, the EU and the UK basically committed their first ever JCPOA violation in plain sight. We have to build on this to bridge the transatlantic gap. The EU retained over 200 missile, military, and nuclear entities that it had promised to give away. And as you know, during the Trump period, the Europeans had no problem drawing a sharp contrast with us and rewarding Iran and chastising us. What we have to do now to work up to the snapback that both Gabe and I want, and both Gabe and I have called for, is a incremental approach. The problem is I would love the snapback, but I know the Europeans, they're probably not going to go for it. So what we have to do is build on what they have retained and share the targeting information of every single missile, military, and nuclear entity that we have sanctioned since leaving the deal in 2018 to bridge that gap and serve as an architecture to get to snapback.
If I may, what glaring gaps exist in the current EU sanctions regime against Iran, and how do these gaps allow Russian aggression and assist their geopolitical goals? Either one of you two.
The big three to me are oil. Europe does not have sanctions on Iran's oil export or their gas exports. Second one, very easy one to do, is banks. That's hard if they're still in the JCPOA to sanction all of Iran's banks. They need to get out of the JCPOA to do so. And then what I would say is airlines, which I mentioned in my testimony, and then finally, financial networks. Currently, you can conduct financial transactions within the EU to Iran. Again, that's protected by the JCPOA currently.
So if you, to follow up on that point, how has the continuation of the administration's JCPOA-centered grand strategy towards Iran benefited Russia? And in your opinion, does it provide cover for some EU members states to oppose effective sanctions on Iran and their?
So what I've seen from Europeans over several years, over 5 years really, is this posture, which I always hear is, if we take certain action, that will imperil the deal. And therefore, we can't impose punitive measures on Iran for fear of escalation. To me, this is the classic evidence of deterrence. Iran has deterred Europe from taking these actions. Again, if you can get Europe to leave the JCPOA is a figment of everyone's imagination at this point. It has no one's abiding by it except the Europeans. They are now giving unilateral sanctions relief to Iran. Iran is not giving them any nuclear concessions or anything back in return. And I think my colleague Dana might have some comments there.
Yes.
So I would simply observe, number one, we have a diplomatic moment right now. Not only are Europeans, if you go talk to members of European governments, extremely concerned about Iran's creep towards nuclear threshold status and its very alarming steps, and are actually thinking through the steps to get to snapback. You don't wake up one day and do it. There's a lot of preparatory steps. There is an openness to having that conversation with our E3 counterparts at this point in time. Number two is, after this weekend's attack, all of the focus is on Iranian aggression. We have an opportunity to work with Europe, and I would agree with my fellow witnesses earlier that U.S. unilateral sanctions are not nearly as potent or effective as multilateral sanctions coordinated with our European and Asian colleagues. So we should take U.S. interest at this point in time, work with them incrementally to continue to ratchet up those sanctions.
And what is the role of the Lukashenko regime in Belarus in facilitating military cooperation between Iran, Russia, and China? Mr. Noronha.
Iran has used the IRGC trainers in Belarus to launch drones at Ukraine. Iran and Belarus signed a military cooperation agreement back in 2023. They're hoping that Iran will help them supply ammunition as well. So I think of Belarus as sort of the little vassal state of Russia. All the problems that we're seeing in the Russo-Iranian relationship, to a minor degree, are the same ones that we're seeing in Belarus.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you very much, Tom Keene. And Gali, how clear is this, an agreement between Iran and Belarus? Even Dr. McCormick is surprised. We now proceed to Congressman Gabe Amo of Rhode Island.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon to our witnesses. I just want to start out by stating the outrage that I have and that we collectively have by Iran's attacks against Israel this weekend. I'm heartened that President Biden directed our military to help stop Iranian drones before they reach their targets in Israel. And we must de-escalate violence in the region and prevent any future attacks from Iran. This attack is the latest reminder why the House must pass the Senate's bipartisan national security package as soon as possible. We cannot continue to delay passing a comprehensive package that supports Israel and Ukraine, as well as humanitarian aid for civilians in Gaza and resources for the Indo-Pacific. Some colleagues mistakenly believe we should abandon our ally Ukraine and only provide aid to Israel. This could not be more misguided. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Iran's attacks on Israel do not occur in isolation. The strong and growing ties between Putin and Ayatollah Khamenei demand that we support our democratic allies. Russia has been purchasing drones from Iran in its illegal invasion in Ukraine. These are the same types of drones that Iran used in its recent attack on Israel. In exchange, Russia provides Israel with digital surveillance technology and anti-tank and anti-aircraft systems captured in Ukraine. These are advanced systems that Iran would not otherwise have because of U.S. sanctions. Recently, leadership at the U.S. Central Command expressed worry that Russia may soon provide Iran with Russian Su-35 fighter aircraft in exchange for more drones and military weapons. Iran's recent drone attack remains a dangerous and serious escalation of violence in the region. But just imagine what an attack using advanced fighters would have looked like. There is no doubt that Iran is gaining access to sophisticated defense technology from Russia. This threatens our safety and security and our allies in the region. I can really only wonder why those who are willing to let Russia continue their war with Ukraine with so much at stake. So, I wanted to ask here now, Ms. Stroul, if you could describe how Russia's assault on Ukraine impacts the likelihood that Russia will provide Iran with additional advanced technology like the Su-35 fighter aircraft.
Thank you for that question, Congressman. Russia cannot continue its war in Ukraine without a steady supply of Iranian military equipment. And it's not getting it for nothing. It has purportedly offered to upgrade Iran's air defenses, to sell the Su-35, as my colleagues here and you have mentioned, as well as other surveillance capabilities, et cetera. So the challenge here is that the United States has pursued foreign military sales and defense equipment across the region to maintain a certain balance of power. No U.S. partner in the region except Israel has fifth-generation fighter aircraft. And our war plans have been developed based on certain assessments of air defenses and the capabilities of our partners. So the more sophisticated defense technology Russia sells to Iran, it is not only a problem for the United States and how we think of our own war plans and contingency scenarios in the Middle East, nor is it only a problem for Israel. It's actually a partner for all of our it's a problem for all of our Arab partners who have certain assumptions and certain plans and certain investments and capabilities. And the question for them is, are they going to look to us for leadership and our own defense industry to make sure they have what they need to defend themselves? Are they going to look to us for commitment that we are going to show up for them, like we just did for Israel over the weekend? Or are they going to hedge and say, well, if Russia's giving Iran all of the sophisticated equipment, I better make sure I'm really good with Tehran and Beijing?
So, by extension there, and I think you've answered this, but I want to ask it to punctuate here, would supporting Ukraine in their fight against Russia's unlawful invasion reduce the chance that Russia provides advanced technology to Iran?
Yes. Adversaries in Europe and the Middle East are looking at each other and looking at our actions and whether or not we can pull together a coalition to support Ukraine and Europe and to support our partners, both Arab and Israel in the Middle East, and Beijing is watching what we're doing in both of these theaters. If the war in Ukraine ends, Russia no longer needs that Iranian supply of weapons, and we would have opportunities to shift that mutual defense exchange.
Well, thank you for that. And I hope that my colleagues in the House know that these efforts are linked, and it's imperative that we take up our responsibility to act in the coming days to pass meaningful legislation for our national security and global stability. With that, I yield back my time.
Thank you very much, Congressman, and we appreciate the freshman from Rhode Island. We now proceed to Ambassador Ann Wagner of Missouri.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank both our Europe and Middle Eastern subcommittees for organizing this incredibly timely and important hearing. In every corner of the globe, America's adversaries are lined up to attack our interests and our allies. Iran's unprecedented direct attack on Israel is a clear warning. Russia, China, and Iran are dangerously emboldened. This crisis demands strong American leadership to disrupt the new axis of evil. Mr. Taleblu, the Washington Post published extensive reporting on Monday on the deepening Russian-Iranian security partnership, including its ramifications for Iran's drone and fighter jet and air defense programs. How will these concerning new partnerships improve Iranian capabilities and embolden Iran to further destabilize the region? And how should the U.S. be working with Israel and other regional partners to better counter this rapidly changing threat?
It actually stands to significantly deepen the cooperation that we've already seen well underway. The test run in Syria, the growing use in Ukraine, and the potential to translate that into a third theater if there is, again, Russo-Iranian strategic convergence that is based on opposing us and our partners. It's been very interesting to hear over the past decade and a half, in nearly every jurisdiction where U.S. policymakers and even U.S. lawmakers say there is no military solution, the likes of Russia, Iran, and the rest of the Axis have actually found a military solution. So this is the imperative of countering their deepening mill-to-mill ties. We have to actually think creatively, and even sometimes on the military side, about how to offset this. A couple of concerning areas. Iran learned from Russia, actually, in the Ukrainian theater, how to shadow drones. Russians have lots of manned aircraft, jets, fighters, just like jets go behind one another. This was reported by Bloomberg, and hide behind the other jet. Drones can go behind one another and hide behind each other. And that's precisely how, in January of this year, using a Shahed 101 drone, Iran killed 3 U.S. service persons in Jordan by mirroring, allegedly, another American drone that was coming in, going up right behind it, and then exploding.
Well,
so this is lethal.
And there you have it. And according to Reuters' article in February, Iran transferred approximately 400 missiles to Moscow, including short-range ballistic missiles. The administration has yet to confirm the transfer of ballistic missile systems, even with Tehran threatening further transfers. And so, Mr. Taleblu, why won't the administration acknowledge the transfer of these weapon systems? And what added capabilities does this give the Russian Federation in Ukraine?
To date, to be honest, we haven't seen the appearance of Iranian ballistic missiles on the battlefield in Ukraine. But it's more a question of when, not if, these systems will come.
They've transferred 400 missiles, so it's when, not if.
Exactly.
And what added capabilities
the
will they
added
have?
capability is it allows Russia to conserve more of its own stockpile, use up these foreign weapons. By the way, the North Koreans have even ballistic missiles. And when you marry up, just like we saw in the strike over the weekend, ballistic missiles, which fly high and fast, cruise missiles, which fly low and slow, and drones, which fly even lower and slower, you have a robust strike package that can overwhelm even the most advanced and integrated air and missile defenses. So that is exactly what Russia is trying to do to Ukraine, and they're doing it on the cheap by using the weapons of the other members of the Axis.
Thank you. It's very, very disturbing. Very disturbing. Mr. Noronha, what role is Western technology playing in sustaining Iran's ability to produce lethal weapons like the Shahed 136 drone? And what more can be done to cut off Iran's procurement of the parts and the technologies they use for drone production?
Well, thank you. As I noted in my testimony, 90% right now is the estimate of how many, 90% of their most advanced components are all coming from Western and mostly American companies in Massachusetts, Texas, Virginia. So the issue is some of these you can go buy on Amazon, but some of these are more specialized, and we need to, it's going to be a tough regulatory issue, but we need to crack down and say, in the same way that we have ITAR regulations, apply those things to any of the components which are being used in those drones. It's going to be cumbersome, but it's unfortunately necessary.
Well, it absolutely is. The world's on fire, and we cannot bury our heads in the sand, and we cannot allow U.S. technology to be used in this kind of nefarious fashion, nor can we allow this axis of evil to move forward. So my time has expired. I thank you for the work that you're doing. We have to triple down on it as a Congress and as those that are working in the administration. Mr. Chairman, I thank you and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman and former Ambassador Ann Wagner of Missouri. We now proceed to Congressman Dina Titus of Nevada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the hearing. We've been hearing how Moscow and Tehran have historically been close partners. It's mostly been driven by shared hostility towards the U.S., but nonetheless, despite after the fall of the Soviet Union, we had better relations with Russia, but they still kept cordial relations with Iran. Now, we've heard a lot about Iran supplying the drones or unmanned vehicles to Russia. Even they've built a factory on the outskirts of Moscow, I understand. But I'd like to talk more about how Russia is aiding Iran. You mentioned, Ms. Stroul, about the M16 35s and I think the Su 35s. Could you talk a little bit more about that relationship and how it's upsetting the balance in the Middle East as opposed to the other direction that it's going?
Thank you for that question. Russia in the Middle East has been the second most significant arms supplier to countries, second to the United States up until now. But what we're seeing is a decision by Russia to transfer increasingly sophisticated defense technology to Iran. It has the potential to enable Iran to have more advanced fighter aircraft than some of our longstanding Arab partners in the region. There is potential for Iran to have more upgraded and advanced air defense radars, which will require updating our own war plans should there be a need to go to war with Iran, should they take certain steps. President Biden has always said military options are on the table. There are a range of other capabilities, and I also heard from my colleagues about space launch vehicles, et cetera. All of this changes the balance of power. And the question for us is what actions can we take to undermine and degrade that transfer, to change the geopolitical and strategic environment around this so that this is not such a potent and mutually reliant partnership, and at the same time to reassure our allies and partners, in particular our Arab partners and Israel in the Middle East. And part of how we would do that is through refreshing how we look at foreign military sales, how we look at security assistance funding, how we look at military exercises, and also the diplomacy and public messaging we can do to make it clear that we are committed to the Middle East and a partner of choice.
So you don't see this as just a temporary matter of convenience because of the certain circumstances in Ukraine. You see this as part of the big picture long term.
I think at this point in time, the regimes in Moscow and Tehran are ideologically oriented to undermine the United States, Western interests, and our unmatched network of allies and partners. And they are doing this not only in the defense and military sector, but across a range of civilian areas as well. And Beijing is looking at it, Pyongyang is looking at it, Venezuela, Damascus, et cetera. And we have to think about what the convergence of all of these adversary, disruptive, revisionist leaders working to undermine the international order from which we benefit today. And that's going to require doubling down on shoring up our own alliances and partnerships, as well as maintaining a variety of coercive measures to degrade this emerging alliance.
You see any of this going on in Turkey?
Which specific thing in Turkey?
Well, just this undermining of relationships and strengthening of coziness with Russia. Oh, maybe you want to address that?
There's one that immediately comes to mind, which is Turkey, as you know, is a member of NATO, but also has the S-400. That's the most advanced Russian surface-air missile system, and it's a historic first for Russia to be able to puncture the NATO alliance system with with Russian weapons. Now, let's actually contrast that with Iran. Iran is not in NATO, and Iran has the S-300. So Iran has an even lesser advanced version of the Russian air defense system that the Russians were willing to sell a NATO country. So in this sense, to a NATO country, Russia can sell exceptionally advanced technology, hoping to create a spoiler. If you know, during the Cold War, Turkey's Western alliance was essential for a lot of our intelligence and military successes in that area. Now, with a country outside of NATO, like the Islamic Republic, you can give significantly more advanced, but not all the way up advanced, surface-to-air missile technology to make any potential American or Israeli strike on Iranian territory even harder. So it's a layered approach. They know how to take advantage of the existing alliance structures while keeping themselves at a distance.
Turkey is a good example of where we took action where we warned. So recalling the CATSA legislation, there was a very significant piece of that legislation. If you make a significant defense purchase from Russia, there will be consequences. And despite the fact that Washington twisted itself in knots for a very long time about this issue, Turkey was written out of the F-35 program and led to a lot of challenges between Ankara and Washington, and had a lot of challenges for the NATO alliance. We are at an interesting moment in time with Turkey. This is a prime example of how skilled patient diplomacy can both address very destabilizing actions and at the same time shore up an important member of NATO.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Titus. And we now proceed to Congressman Dr. Rich McCormick of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my opinion that the Iranian government is perhaps the most notorious government we had to deal with in foreign affairs, sponsoring terror all over the world right now, not just in the Middle East, but all over the world, literally supplying our enemies with weapons that can hurt both United States citizens abroad as well as our allies all over the world. And yet, our sanctions passed. Well, you mentioned, I think recently, just during your testimony today, the JCPOA and its ineffectiveness. The United Nations sanctions the United States sanctions that we had through Obama giving billions of dollars to basically get rid of a nuclear program, I believe is it expired already?
Large parts of the JCPOA have all expired, and 90% of the UN sanctions have
expired. I saw that too. 2020 and 2025, the rest will expire. And ironically, through all this holding them back, I think they still have procured enough uranium to basically make 3 nuclear weapons within a couple days to a couple weeks, essentially. So it really didn't do what it was supposed to do, even though we paid them to do that. They continue to have the money to fund terrorist organizations and weaponize them all. And meanwhile, they've built all this technology for cyber weapons, obviously drones, other weaponry that they're producing all the world. And they've killed Americans, essentially, producing weapons that have been used against us directly. We lost 3 Georgians recently, and you mentioned that also in your testimony. So how does it make any sense that new sanctions are going to help us when the old sanctions didn't help us to begin with? In other words, cheaters cheat. I'm concerned that we're not doing enough and that we're not using our cybersecurity or even our cyber weapons, our ability to undercut their energy production and their funding of this, and as well as literally destroy the weapon-producing facilities that are killing Americans and our allies. We're at war, as far as I'm concerned. Why would we rely on sanctions? I'll let both of you answer this in a second, because I think this is really important. This is the bottom line. Why not do something effective while we have the ability? When they talk about a commensurate response, we keep on waiting for somebody to get hurt or killed before we respond with like-kindedness. We are the biggest, baddest players on the planet, and yes, we want to wait until they're strong enough to harm us before we have a commensurate response. Anybody who's been to warfighting college, anybody who's been to command and staff, anybody who's anything in the military who's marched up the ladder understands you do not respond with like-kindedness. You respond with overwhelming force, and people get that. Reagan did it in Libya. They understood. You could even say that Bill Clinton did it in Somalia, and they understood. When you respond with strength, people understand. Why are we wasting our time with sanctions when we can actually do something about it? I'll let both of you respond.
Thank you, Congressman. I think at this point in time, sanctions are a necessary but not sufficient element of the equation, particularly when you look at the growing Russia-Iran partnership. One example, the drones, right? We need sanctions to go after the defense industrial base of Russia, the defense industrial base of Iran. You need good regulatory measures and tough export controls to go after the technology that goes into those weapons that feed into the foreign and domestic supply chains. Then on the back end, you need good local intelligence in the places that the Iranians and Russians are using the drones to figure out the battle tactics, to figure out how they're used. You need to make sure that your partners in those local jurisdictions have good air and missile defenses to shoot them down. And talk about punishment. You want to make sure that your partners who are forward deployed in that area have the capability to respond in kind. So if it's a place like Ukraine, for example, you know, the Russians get Iranian drones, the Ukrainians should get ATACMS, and they have, and there's their UK Storm Shadow as well. So you want to be able to go tit for tat. This is like a cocktail kind of approach, and not any one of these will be enough to deter the Iranian or Russian use. What will be enough to deter the Russian or Iranian use is throwing this cocktail at them and ratcheting it up over time. It's not punishment, it's punishment over time that gets an adversary to back down.
I associate myself with his remarks. What I would say is we have escalation dominance, but we need to be able to maintain escalation dominance. We cannot take that for granted. To me, when I was imposing sanctions on Iran, it was about how do you bankrupt their war machine? How do you make them have to do their defense sequestration so they have to cut their own procurement lines? We were doing that. They had to shutter some of their centrifuges because they couldn't even buy new centrifuges. They couldn't produce certain munition rounds and tanks. We need to get back to doing that. We can get back to a posture where they are down to maybe 500,000 barrels of oil per day. We can do that. We just have to have the political will to sanction certain things. It's quality, not quantity, when it comes to sanctions, is something we should consider.
I agree with both of you. I think we do more, both through sanctions and other strong force-willed policy. But the main thing is that we just pay attention to which administrations are doing what, and when you want to see who's soft on crime, so to speak, it's evident. We need to come hard. Thank you. With that, I yield.
Thank you very much, Congressman Dr. Rich McCormick. And we now proceed to Congresswoman Kathy Manning, of North Carolina, who's going to be very sorely missed in that she has announced as a statesperson not to run for re-election. Congresswoman Manning.
Thank you to my friend Chairman Wilson, my friend Chairman Kaine, and of course Ranking Member Keating for this holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. So Russia's illegal invasion and ongoing aggression in Ukraine is the most significant threat to our rules-based international order in decades. And Iran is the world's leading sponsor of terrorism. It poses a direct threat to our ally Israel, and as we saw on Saturday, it attacked Israel with an unprecedented drone and missile attack on civilian populations. And let's be clear, had it not been for the extraordinary defensive measures by the US, the UK, Israel, and others, the Iranian attack last Saturday could have resulted in devastating loss of life in Israel. And as you mentioned in your remarks, Ms. Stroul, Iran's next attack on Israel could be much more lethal. So we should be doing everything possible to disrupt this growing diabolical relationship between Iran and Russia, to protect our own interests and to protect the interests of the free world. I want to follow up, Ms. Stroul, on Representative Amo's questions about the Su fighter aircraft. As you mentioned in your testimony, if Iran were to provide ballistic missiles to Russia and Russia were to provide the Su-35 fighter aircraft to Iran, what should our response be, and should there be consequences?
I think there should absolutely be consequences. The question is, how do we do the cocktail approach to steadily ratchet up pressure? So first of all, we will face a policy question here, and your committee will have a serious role in discussing whether or not it changes the kinds of weapons and platforms we're willing to sell to our partners in the region, number one. Number two, the administration did downgrade intelligence to highlight the consideration in Tehran of ballistic missiles to Russia. Referring to earlier questions, there is no evidence that that transfer has happened yet, but we should be planning as if it's going to happen because Russia is reliant on Iran.
Is there anything we could do to stop that transfer?
Well, there are ways that we could continue to make it very difficult for that transfer to happen. The airlines that are transporting it, the Caspian Sea trade that's happening, there are a range of other options as well. Generally, if Iran decides to make that decision to transfer ballistic missiles to Russia, it's not only about the security and safety of Ukraine. It's about Europe, it's about the Middle East, it's about Israel, and of course, it's also about our allies in other theaters. So what we're seeing, especially after this weekend, is a significant effort to coordinate, galvanize, and energize allies and partners. The sanctions being contemplated this week, I think, are a step and an important first step, but it can't stop there. And we're going to have to continue this coordination.
Let me just follow up on that question because Russia and Iran are two of the most sanctioned countries in the world. So given that reality, we can talk about more sanctions, but what is the single most significant thing the U.S. or our partners and allies could do to force a change of behavior in these regimes?
I'm not sure there's one most significant single thing. I do think we have to be smart about sanctions. One of the reasons that both of them have not felt the pressure as hydrocarbon economies is because they are trading lessons on how to do illicit ship-to-ship oil transfers at sea, turning off the GPS corresponders of the ships. We have for a long time thought through how to deny Iran access to SWIFT, the international financial mechanism. They're developing an alternative to SWIFT. They are working on de-dollarizing their trade. If they continue with these very significant economic moves, and then you have a Beijing, a Pyongyang, a Caracas join in, then we have a serious challenge with the efficacy of our sanctions regimes, which means we cannot do this alone and unilaterally. We have to be working with our allies and partners.
Thank you. Mr. Noronha, you wanted to jump in.
To build off of my colleague's comments, I think Europe might actually have more leverage than we do on this because we've done so many of these things. So if Europe presents something to Iran and says, if you conduct this transfer of ballistic missiles, then we snap back or then we shut off the airlines, deterrence is the question.
So what if they were to actually designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization? Would that be a good place to start?
I think that is something that would irritate them immensely.
Thank you. Unfortunately, my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Kathy Manning of North Carolina. We now proceed to Congressman Darrell Issa of California.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Stroul, I'm going to continue on where you left off. Is it fair to say that in the case of Iran, if you don't cut off the oil, you cut off nothing?
In the past, we have sought to cut off oil sales and dampen that. Their behavior and investment in terrorism did not change, so I think it's important but can't stand on its own.
So if what others have said already here today, that at the end of the last administration, Iran was broke, they were having to shut down their investments, even in their nuclear program, and they were begging for opportunities to feed their people, quite frankly, so they could divert what money they had to other things. That is not the case now. Is there any substantial difference between 3 years ago and today other than the quantity of oil they're making available for profit?
I think it's also important to recognize that they did react to the maximum pressure campaign in the previous administration by using force, first by seeking to mine and target tankers in the Arabian Gulf, and secondly by launching an attack on Abqaiq in 2019 against Saudi Arabia. In both cases, our partners asked for military support and they did not receive it from the United States, which shook the confidence of our partners. So I think looking at it only in the binary way that argument was presented misses some of the context.
I'm not saying we shouldn't do more. I just want to make sure I understand that if we fail, in this member's opinion, if we fail to cut off the oil, which would require interdicting at sea ships that are taking on Iranian oil directly and indirectly, if we don't do that, when we miss the opportunity to stop the funding, notwithstanding direct funding the United States has provided, I agree with you that we also have to defend our neighbors. And when I met with the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia, he made it very clear he did not choose to go to Iran to cut a deal. He was forced to go to Iran to cut a deal because of our inaction. Let me change the course a little bit on this. Mr. Taleblu, do you know the current status of the $6 billion that was agreed to be released from South Korea?
Are you referring to the one that was passed through in Qatar and,
yes,
accordingly to the latest reports, was allegedly designed to be, or was allegedly supposed to be frozen after October 7th? So based on press reports / what was leaked from the administration to reporters, it's supposed to be frozen in Qatar. I seriously think that that should be checked in terms of oversight capabilities of the U.S. Congress to make sure that that is actually being frozen in a post-October 7 and in a post-April 13, April 14 world. We cannot be affording to give a dime to the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, particularly when this administration's own Treasury personnel comes before the U.S. Congress, Messer Adameo, and talks about how even in the past, when it comes to humanitarian sanctions waivers, the government of the Islamic Republic prioritized funding the IRGC, not feeding the Iranian people.
Following up on that, the late Senator McCain once called Russia a gas station impersonating a country. Is it fair to say Iran is effectively a gas station in that they have very few internal resources of true development other than that which they glean through their export of oil?
I would slightly qualify it as a proud Iranian American that, you know, Iran is indeed has home to a glorious civilization. The Islamic Republic of Iran does not do justice to that civilization. The Islamic Republic of Iran is a poor guardian of the Iranian national interest and functions akin to a mafia that generates revenue from oil and gas that we have to sanction.
Notwithstanding the Iranian people, I was referring to the GDP of the country in this era. And I say so for a reason. If not for the weapons production capability, which almost exclusively depends on Chinese cooperation, technology, and parts, would Iran be in a position effectively to export or even to fire the drones they fired over the weekend?
Partially, yes. Not entirely, but partially, yes. The Islamic Republic has been developing a robust defense industrial base, which requires us to keep pace with the growth of this base, not just based on illicit foreign procurement that comes through Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, China, and other jurisdictions of weak central authority, potentially with technology in Turkey and the UAE and Oman as well. But
so
the
is
success
it
for us
with the remaining time, is it fair to say that if we don't cut off those illicit imports of technology and parts, they will eventually have greater and greater internal capability to produce weapons of destruction?
Absolutely. But the money you want to go after is oil and petrochemical. Those are the two big financial lifelines, oil and petrochemical.
Good closing. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Darrell Issa, for your incisive questions. And we now proceed to Congresswoman Madeleine Dean of Pennsylvania.
I thank you, Chairman Wilson, Chairman Kane, Ranking Member Keating for holding this timely hearing, and thank you to our witnesses today for your expertise and perspective. As broadly discussed in all of your testimony to our committee, Iran and Russia are moving toward greater and greater cooperation, largely focused on their mutual desire to combat the United States and Western influences. The growth in relations has only accelerated, I think we believe, and have seen since the start of the war in Ukraine. The reported expansion of military cooperation is particularly disturbing, especially considering Russia's continuing aggression in Ukraine and Iran's stark, unprecedented attack on Israel over the weekend with more than 300 missiles and drones. Just a devastating attack. Fortunately, the defense was extraordinary and multinational, as you pointed out. Ms. Stroul and Mr. Taleblu, you both ended your testimony with the point number 6 and point final, the importance of passing the National Security Supplemental. I agree with you. It was 6 months ago that the administration, it was late October 20th, the administration called for the National Security Supplemental, notably after the horrific attack in Israel by Hamas. You both call on that as the very important last item. And Mr. Taleblu, you said in your written statement, quote, there couldn't be a starker contrast between Russia's recent uptick in the use of Iranian drones and stalled debates in Washington over supplemental funding to support Ukraine. Beside the moral reasons, there are strategic ones why the Russo-Iranian model of the war must be defeated in Ukraine. What's going on? What are we risking through this long stall?
While I understand that you have multiple other financial, domestic, legal, other prerogatives, the longer we do stall, the greater this cooperation solidifies in a trend line. Remember, Syria was the start, Ukraine is the present. There could be an even more dangerous future. Again, I respect and understand the need to debate over funding and priorities, but at this present moment, the ability of our adversaries to put aside their differences, in fact, be able to compartmentalize their differences. Russia and Iran are actually competing to sell China discounted sanctioned oil, but they're still able to do that and tighten military ties. So if our authoritarian adversaries can do it, there is absolutely no reason why us and our democratic partners and allies should not be doing this. This should be the price floor to ramp up our cooperation with Ukraine against Putin in Russia.
And you're quite courteous to say that there's important debate going on. There's sad stalling going on. We should have supported our ally, Ukraine, much earlier. Obviously, we were very important in the beginning and we will continue to be important to Ukraine. There is no reason for this long stall. And of course, Israel needs us as its friend and ally as it faces its security issues. Ms. Stroul, I wanted to ask you what you think about this pause, this stall. If we fail to pass the National Security Supplemental, if we continue to stumble and stall as a result of politics, what's at risk? And if you can, layer in the risk of election interference.
Thank you for the question. Since my colleague Behnam talked about the implications in Ukraine, I think the implications for how the world views United States leadership and partnership is at risk. So if they see us after 2 years of working to provide Ukraine security assistance, not for us to fight Russian aggression, but to enable Ukraine to fight Russian aggression and defend their territory, then adversaries in other theaters will feel very emboldened. So it's not just about Ukraine. If the world sees us picking partners, picking Israel and not Ukraine, then they will think that they can play off differences, sow divisions, and maybe we pick one partner another day and somebody else the next day. And again, our partners will question our staying power and commitment to their security. And of course, while we spend a lot of time focusing right now on Ukraine and on Israel, there's just no question that Beijing is watching this with glee and delight and making sure and preparing for how to sow division here so that we have our own debates about when and where to support Taiwan or other smaller states in the Indo-PACOM theater that are under intimidation and coercive behavior by Beijing and are preparing for that day.
I couldn't agree with you more. I know you signaled you wanted to add one more thing.
One very quick thing, perhaps this might help the debate in Congress. Iran's chief terrorist, Qasem Soleimani, who the Trump administration killed in January 2020, used to have a saying when he would travel the Middle East. He used to say, "We're not like the Americans. We don't abandon our friends." Let that sink in.
And may all of our colleagues hear that, both here and on the Senate side. You don't pick and choose friends. You're a friend this week, you're not a friend that week. We stand strong with our allies. We must pass the National Security Supplemental for the security of Israel, for the humanitarian aid that needs to get into Gaza and other regions of the world, to the Palestinians and the West Bank as well, and of course, to continue to support Ukraine. If we fail to support Ukraine, we fail ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Dean. We now proceed to Congressman Jim Baird of Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. My question deals with the assessment of the expiration of the United Nations missile and long-range drone embargo on Iran and how that's impacted Russia's willingness to procure missiles. And while you're on that, if Iran follows through on the deal to transfer hundreds of missiles to Russia, how would it impact Russia's operations in Ukraine? And I'd like to start in reverse order so that Ms. Stroul, you get to go first.
First of all, I think public reporting has suggested that that the majority of Iran's ballistic missiles in the attack on April 13th at Israel failed in flight. So that should cause us to think through how we think about coercion and use of force against Iran in our own war plans. And I think our partner should be thinking twice about the way in which they might be intimidated by Iranian threats of aggression. Number two, however, the transfer of ballistic missiles to Russia for use in Ukraine is incredibly serious. We would need to think through the kinds of air defenses that we're supplying Ukraine. We'd have to get more faster in coordination with our allies in Europe. We should think through, again, this cocktail of additional coercive measures at Russia and Iran for that supply. I would hope to see more downgraded intelligence to shine a light on the risks of what this is, more training and offers of support to Ukrainian forces. And we should think through ways to sabotage and undermine the actual physical transfer of those capabilities.
Representative, I recently read quotes from an anonymous Russian official stating explicitly, there's no international prohibition against buying Iranian missiles anymore, so what's your concern? The arms embargo has expired, so we're fully within our right to purchase this. Slight paraphrase. The other things that we should be watching is other countries also taking advantage of this. Sudan, the Sudanese Armed Forces, is reportedly looking to buy Iranian drones. China is looking to supply both Iran and Russia with ammonium perchlorate, which is used in missile fuel. So this is not hypothetical. There's a lot of countries saying, hey, the international embargo has expired. We have full legal rights to now execute on these things. So that's why I'm harping quite a bit on this snapback.
The quote that Gabe just mentioned, sir, about the Russians saying that they will not adhere to any international legal restrictions because there are no international legal restrictions. The Russians literally said, I think a day after those UN sanctions expired on October 18, 2023. So it just goes to show you the cost of inaction. I think a price floor, again, a la what Gabe was saying, was snapback. Snapback doesn't just restore these older penalties on Iran, it restores a permanent international arms transfer prohibition to and from Iran, and it restores a permanent ballistic missile testing and transfer prohibition on the Islamic Republic of Iran. These are permanent, and they would be diplomatic wins you enshrine in the UN Security Council. Three other quick things. Totally agree with Dana in terms of public diplomacy. More intel sharing about Russo-Iranian cooperation can get more people to be concerned about and potentially help to deter that. Number two is USG messaging. We have significant Persian language and Russian language media through the Broadcasting Board of Governors. Every single day, these media outlets, in my view, should be talking about the historic enmity that used to exist between Russia and Iran. My testimony details the turbulent Russo-Iranian past that every Iranian nationalist knows, from taking away territory to causing famine to trying to sponsor separatist insurrection to support for communist parties in Iran. This was a turbulent relationship, and the less political space the leadership in Iran has to maneuver, the better it will be for us. In 2016, for example, Russia used to stage bombers from Iranian bases to go hit Syria. They couldn't do that anymore once this story became public. So don't be afraid to put the spotlight on the cooperation.
Thank you. I appreciate all your answers, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Jim Baird. We now proceed to Congressman Brad Sherman of California.
Ms. Stroul, did I hear you right that you say that half of the 300 missiles and drones aimed at Israel just fell from flight without being shot down?
A good percentage of the ballistic missiles.
Well, mostly it was drones, though, in terms of numbers,
missiles.
not in terms of impact, but in terms of numbers. I would point out that I look forward to us hopefully developing laser weapons that would be the answers to these cheap and fragile drones. We start with the idea that both Russia and Iran are evil, and then we jump to the conclusion that they're infinitely evil. And I'm not sure that's the case, at least with regard to Russia. What has Russia not done that they could have gotten away with as far as providing fissile material to Iran? Iran doesn't have enough fissile material for 20 or 30 nuclear weapons. Could Russia have easily provided that, and could they have gotten away with it? I'll ask the, yes.
There was a period in time, particularly in the post-Cold War period from the 1990s to about the early 2000s, where the Clinton administration was able to successfully leverage a Western-looking Russia to not provide Iran with this stuff. So, for example, the Russians got...
I'm talking about now. I mean, Putin obviously has staked his career on success in Ukraine. He finds the drones from Iran useful, but as far as been reported to this committee, he has not provided nuclear know-how, fissile material, or worse yet, an fully assembled nuclear weapon to Iran. Do we have evidence that he has, and what is the risk that he will?
We do not have evidence that he has, but we also have a lot of outstanding questions. For example, Russia is still slated to produce a new reactor for Iran in Bushehr. Russia's activities per the JCPOA require them to help verify things at Fordo, and Russia per the JCPOA was home to Iran's excess enriched uranium, which we don't know the status of those.
That was part of the deal. They were supposed to be. I'll go to the...
There was declassified information in 2022 that Iran sought certain nuclear materials from from Russia. We don't have declassified information that Russia obliged that. Well, I would note...
I want to go on to another topic, and that is we're talking about limiting these drone parts, and obviously we should, but just because the majority are made in the United States doesn't mean that other countries don't have the capacity. Does China have the capacity to make the very drone parts that our panel has asked us not to export?
Some of them, but not all of them.
And how long would it take for them to be able to do all of them?
If they were intent on it, a year or two. These are not terribly advanced. They're moderately advanced.
Drones are for sale at hobby stores. They're not the most advanced of military equipment. I'd point out that many of us on this committee urged that we arm Ukraine before February 2022. Had we done that, there might not have been a February 24th, 2022. And now it's critical that we provide weapons to Taiwan, because an invasion of Taiwan would be an even worse outcome for our national security. Let's see. If we had snapback and Russia was prohibited from buying drones from Iran, would they adhere to that?
No, they would not. But what snapback does do is it grants all UN member states both the right and it obliges them to inspect and seize any cargo in their airspace or sea territory that may be containing prohibited items. So anything from the Black Sea.
This prohibits weapons from going from Iran to Russia, albeit that doesn't go through anybody's airspace except, it goes over Azeri airspace. I don't know if we could count on Azerbaijan to force down a Russian plane or an Iranian plane. Would it entitle those countries to interrupt parts shipments going into Iran?
Yes.
So that might be helpful. And it's possible that China would adhere to the sanctions.
China tends to be pretty, they're not perfect by any means, but they don't want to get too far afield. And then countries like Sudan might not purchase Iranian drones if it's prohibited.
Don't count on Sudan.
Might.
Sudan's more likely to violate the UN than Russia, and I yield back. And there are at least two governments in Sudan right now. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Sherman. And I want to point out the sophistication of drones. At truck stops, they cost $29.95. And then at Ollie's Outlet, you can get a very advanced one for $39.95. But a person who doesn't need to buy one, but the most persistent person here paying attention the whole time, and he's not the last one, but Congressman Brian Mast of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've thoroughly enjoyed this panel. I thought you have been analytical and specific, and have enjoyed it from beginning to end. I want to get into some specific economic questions, and I hope that that's okay that you all are. If you don't know, just say you don't know, because we're talking about specific numbers. I'm not trying to nail you down. I'm just trying to really understand some things. What do we understand the GDP of Russia to be? My estimate, 2 billion. Somebody else in here has something to say?
2
By all means,
trillion.
blurt it. 2 trillion, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say billion, trillion. 2 trillion.
Trillions, roughly.
2 trillion, roughly, right? We have an estimate for EU GDP,
20.
20. That's what I was thinking, 20, 25 trillion. Maybe, or 15 to 20 trillion. I'd say 25 trillion for the United States, right? We have an estimate for Ukraine GDP in the billions.
Billions, I think.
Maybe
don't have
200
that.
billion. Maybe
Higher
less.
than that, I think. But
Higher? 500?
somewhere around there. I apologize. I don't have the.
No, it's okay.
fidelity on this.
You were not given these specific questions in advance or anything, so you're not expected to actually know exactly what they are, but it's important to realize what, to your knowledge, is Russia having a capability to, or who, to your knowledge, is Russia having a capability to export to right now?
They export large volumes of oil to India as their primary exporter. China is their secondary exporter. They're still doing decently large volumes to European Union countries, particularly in gas condensate, and then hodgepodge all over the world. Nickel, aluminum, potash, lumber, lots of other exports besides petrochemicals that they're still doing across the world, including to the United States.
And what is your worry as you look at the oil and gas exports specifically about those coming back around in a circle to European nations from India, China, Iran, anybody?
We know that Russia and Iran use each other to disguise their own oil shipments. So Russia uses Iran as a sanctions evasion hub. They do ship-to-ship transfers. They do fake invoices. So a very sophisticated system to use and abuse any and all financial systems.
No doubt about it. And some of the conversation we've had already about snapback sanctions as it relates to Iran would specifically help European Union members and others from not being able to have Russian energy or something else come back and essentially be funding the entity that we're at war with. So it's important to look at that as well. Do you see currently in Russia, would you assess economic growth or economic decline?
They're slated to grow at 3.5% last quarter and over 3% this year, much higher than the EU or the United States, and about on par with the United States.
What do you attribute the economic growth to in Russia as they're at war, committing more to war resources, and there are sanctions on them? How are they growing?
It's mostly their oil and petrochemical sales, which are higher today than they were before the war.
So, and again, go specifically to where do you put the most profit coming in for them from?
India and China being second to that. They're
Any
not
numbers?
they're not
Numbers you could put on that to specifically gauge what the numbers are on their economic growth? Because
they exported $120 billion in oil in 2021 in petrochemicals. They exported $180 billion in 2022. So roughly a quarter of that India, roughly a quarter of that China, and then the rest of the world.
Okay. Let's go to some some specific war numbers. What do you assess Russia will be spending on the Ukraine war in 2024? Or what do you assess that they spent in 2023?
They are spending 6% of their GDP on defense. They have managed to raise their defense spending. They have not increased their debt. Their debt to GDP is 18%. It has stayed at 18% the last 3 years, while ours has ballooned to 130%.
Why do you assess, if you do, that the EU cannot foot the bill, given the GDP of the EU versus the GDP of Russia, it being substantially more, that the EU can't flip the bill for the war against Ukraine?
In my view, in my assessment, it's a political choice. They've chosen to fund social programs and domestic priorities, climate initiatives, and they have chosen not to spend certain defense numbers. That's Europe as a whole. That's not true for Eastern
Quickly,
Europe.
in your estimation, you would say that EU could foot the bill for Russian deterrence, deterring this Russian aggression, helping Ukraine fight the war if they had a reappropriation of their resources.
They certainly have the fiscal space. They do not have, they have the fiscal space, they have the debt space, they have the ability to raise debt in a way that they can do it if they so wish.
That's very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman Brian Mast of Florida. We now proceed to Congressman Brad Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for your time. As was said, this has been a very insightful and informative conversation. I want to pick up on some things you were saying. It was noted that the growing relationship between Iran and Russia is a threat to the United States, our interests, and our allies in the rules-based international order. Let me just ask and go down the line. Do you agree, Mr. Ben Taleblu, do you agree with that?
Yes, indeed, it is a threat.
Mr. Noronha?
Yes, it is a threat.
Ms. Stroul?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Noronha, I'm going to quote you, and you said with respect to Iran or Russia, quote, "It is unwise and deeply myopic for leaders in the West to believe they can ignore one country's threats and still hope to counter the threats of the other, that these two things are linked." So I won't ask you if you agree with it, but Mr. Ben Taleblu, do you agree with that statement?
Yes, there is that linkage.
Okay. Ms. Stroul?
Yes.
Okay. And all of you, and thank you for this, and we will hopefully put this to good use, you brought to us a number of what I'll call wise and good recommendations for what we can do, what we can and should do to address the growing Russia-Iran partnership. But let me ask the group again, is there anything more important or more urgent than passing the essential national security-related funding bills for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan? I'll go the other way. Ms. Stroul?
There is nothing more important.
Mr. Noronha?
There is nothing more important.
Mr. Ben Taleblu?
There's a lot of close seconds, but there's nothing more important.
All right, so I think we have consensus, and I agree with you 100%. This is the most important thing we need to do. We should have done it last year when President Biden made the request. We certainly should have passed it in the House more than 2 months ago when the Senate passed their bill, and I'm going to argue we're wasting time now putting a different bill that will then have to, or set of 3 bills that will have to go through the machinations of Congress, back to the Senate, and then hopefully to the President, with no guarantees. So let me ask a final question on this line of thought. What are the consequences if Speaker Johnson's plans fail and the House does not act? I'll open that up to anyone who wants to jump in. Mr. Noronha?
Thinking about the consequences if Ukraine loses and we have Russian forces on the border, truly on the borders of NATO, it's going to complicate the problem of deterring an Iranian nuclear breakout. If U.S. forces have to go flood into EUCOM again, if CENTCOM's getting deprioritized, it's much harder, and I think my colleague can speak to this, to prevent all the issues that we would have to deal with to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. The follow-on effects of losing Ukraine are enormously catastrophic for Israel, for our Middle East security goals. It is not just limited to this one theater.
Before I come to you, Ms. Stroul, I want to emphasize something. You said, so basically, if Russia wins in Ukraine, it is more likely that Iran breaks out with a nuclear weapon. You also said earlier that if Russia wins, it's also more likely Iran has bases in Europe armed with nuclear weapons.
That is my assessment. I think that latter one is hopefully a low probability, but it is not zero.
It's a real risk, Ms. Stroul.
When we talk about the rules-based international order, what we mean is that Putin is seeking to change internationally recognized boundaries by force. If he succeeds in doing that, and the world does not hold the line at Ukraine, what Iran wants in the Middle East is to be the regional hegemon. Iran does not want to stay in its borders. It wants to challenge that. Why is it fomenting all of these proxies and non-state actors across the Middle East to challenge the borders of Israel? And China, what does China want? Taiwan. So every adversary in every theater will think that there is a chance that they will be able to get out of jail free by changing internationally recognized borders by force, and that the United States will not stand with its allies and partners in defending those borders.
I couldn't agree with you more, and at the risk, and maybe the chair would give me another 90 minutes, we could have a whole history lecture. But Russia is aspiring, in my view, to restore a bygone empire. Iran is struggling to restore its bygone empire. China, the same. The modern world order, as we talk about it, the rules-based order, is, as you said, where nations respect each other's boundaries, where alliances are built, where working together in the world, countries establish
relationships diplomatically, trade, economies grow, people live in peace, security, and prosperity. That's the world the United States helped create after World War II. It's the world that we want to preserve, and it's the world that is under dire threat, both in Ukraine because of Russia's attack, in the Middle East because of Iran's actions, and in the Pacific, Indo-Pacific, which is why it's so important that we pass this supplemental funding bill. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Brad Schneider of Illinois. We now proceed to Congressman Keith Self of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me help you with the GDPs. The United States is roughly 29 trillion. The EU is roughly 20 trillion. Russia is 2.5 trillion. Texas, my state, Texas alone, 1.8 trillion. I want to move to something very mundane, logistics. There are multiple Iranian airliners that fly through NATO countries to Russia. There are sanctions on these airlines. First question is, what has the Biden administration done to enforce sanctions on several of the Iranian airlines?
These sanctions have been on these airlines, some since the Obama administration, others imposed in the Trump administration. There has been no secondary sanctions enforcement on those airlines, really, period. Meaning if airports refuel these airliners, no consequences for the air crew, any of these things. There's simply been zero secondary sanctions enforcement.
So if I can follow up on that, and the sanctions, I believe, talk about material support. Is it not true that if an airliner lands on an airport, that in and of itself is material support? It is. How much on these Iranian airliners, what do they transport into Russia? How much? What do you estimate?
There were 72 flights in the first 2 months of the war, of Russia's war into Ukraine, that, according to some reports, were military flights, again, containing ammunition, likely containing ammunition, suicide drones, personnel. That's an intel question. I'm not exactly sure, but quite a bit, I think, is the answer. Again, some of this is an intel question.
Okay, what can you tell us about their activities to support the IRGC since October the 7th?
Mahan Air and Iran Air were both sanctioned for providing support for the IRGC, sending, even in some case, ballistic missile parts into Syria disguised as alternate cargo. One of the big issues with these airlines is they lie about their cargo manifests to smuggle in weapons and other dangerous WMD proliferation materials. That's, again, another reason Europe shouldn't allow them into their airspace at all, because they lie about their crew in Latin America. They lied and had IRGC officers disguised as crew members. They lie about everything of their activities.
And how would you recommend Congress taking action to try to disrupt their supply lines in these airliners? Because obviously sanctions are not working.
I think, I believe you may have led a letter to the UK asking them to take this seriously.
To several countries.
There's an issue. Those ministries of foreign affairs don't necessarily tell the airports they've even gotten that letter. If those airports realized that they were liable to U.S. sanctions and could get sanctioned, or if they could realize that, hey, you might not get U.S. airliners to your airport for a few months over this issue, they would very rapidly, in my view, an assessment, shut off these flights. Again, there aren't that many flights from Iran Air and Mahan Air into Europe. They're more important for Iran than they are for these airports. They can do without them.
So what you're saying is we ought to target the airports, not the foreign ministers.
Correct. It is the bankers and executive boards and lawyers who are the ones making the call here, not politicians.
Very good. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Self. And I want to point out how modest Congressman Self is. There's no question the GDP of Texas is larger than the Russian Federation. And any country that lies about cargo manifest, those numbers are not correct, okay? And so I can't believe a Texan being modest, but it has occurred. Now we go to Congressman Mike Lawler of New York.
Another bastion of modesty. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After this past weekend's attack on Israel, which marked the first direct attack on Israeli territory launched from Iranian territory, the Biden administration cannot ignore that their policies of appeasement have emboldened the Iranian regime. The president has failed to enforce sanctions on Iran's illicit oil trade, allowing the regime to rack up tens of billions of dollars in new revenue, over $88 billion. This money funds its proxy wars against Israel and our troops. No question about it. The president also continues to exercise waiver authority to free up billions of dollars for Iran. Further, the administration has been engaging in informal negotiations with Iran on a nuclear deal during its tenure, giving credibility to Iran's development of these capabilities and purposefully withholding any information about it from Congress. The erratic behavior on the part of the president and his continued attempts at bowing down to the Iranian regime must stop. And it begins with passing important legislation like the SHIP Act and the Iran-China Energy Sanctions Act, two bills that I introduced that would put in place stronger sanctions on the illicit Iranian oil trade. Mr. Taleblu, do you agree that the Biden administration's apologetic Iran policies have emboldened their terrorist regime?
Unfortunately, very much yes, sir. I think the first example of even slight attempt at oil sanctions enforcement came 16 months into the Biden administration's term. I think it was May 2022. So that is far too long.
Do you have other instances to support this viewpoint?
Broadly, there's a whole series of pulled punches. The fact that the administration's even stated aim for diplomacy with Iran changed so much over time gave Iran the impression that it could get away with a lot more. You may remember during the campaign period, they talked about longer and stronger. Once they started negotiating with the Iranians via the Europeans, they talked about JCPOA resurrection. Then there was talk of all these smaller deals, side deals, and particularly a lot of the hostage deals, the waivers that came to the Islamic Republic, basically creating room for the regime to breathe under sanctions, actually undermine the administration's own stated aim of a diplomatic resolution.
Just yesterday, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee marked up and passed the SHIP Act. And we passed this through the House last fall. Seemingly, it only took 130 ballistic missiles for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and Senate Democrats to realize that there was a problem with the illicit Iranian oil trade. Do you believe that Senator Schumer should immediately put this bill on the floor?
Absolutely, sir, and I thank you for your leadership on pointing out the Iran-China energy nexus. China has been the biggest in the past decade, licit and illicit importer of Iranian crude oil. This fact cannot go understated. I think your legislation goes a far way towards targeting it.
I mean, roughly 80% of Iranian petroleum is purchased by China. $88 billion in increased revenue. Iran is the greatest state sponsor of terror, funding Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. 93% of Hamas's budget comes from Iran. This is a crisis. We must cut off the funding stream at its source, this illicit oil trade. And that's why we've put this legislation forward to not only enact secondary sanctions on the purchaser, but also on the financial institutions which are facilitating the trade. Yes, sir.
When I was at the State Department 5 years ago working on this particular problem, one of the things that really worried me was that China was creating what I call sanctions-proof entities, so that you sanction them and they say, who cares, we're not connected to the U.S. financial system.
Right.
The way
These little teapots.
The way, in my view, that the U.S. should solve this is we can create leverage on other fronts. They care a whole lot about semiconductors, about trade, about aluminum, things that have nothing to do with the Iran file. We need to, in my view, need to establish leverage on a series of things and then lever that on reductions in Iranian oil imports.
I agree with that. That's an important point to make. As I'm sure you know, in the days before Iran's attack on Israel, the President and Senate Majority Leader Schumer made some troubling statements about Israel's leadership and their domestic affairs. No one in our country should be interfering in Israeli elections, especially our elected officials. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, Congressman. I'll go one step further. Any daylight between the U.S. and Israel benefits directly the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Agree. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Lawler, and thank you for raising the issue about sale of oil. It's heartbreaking to me that the world's largest democracy, India, is buying oil from war criminal Putin to help finance the invasion and murderous invasion. I just can't fathom such a country so important as India doing this. We're very fortunate as we conclude, we have the Congressman Mayor, Tim Burchett of Tennessee.
Thank you. I prefer to be called the 435th most powerful member of Congress. Thank you. This is to all y'all. It's documented by the nonprofit United Against Nuclear Iran. Since the imposition of the price cap, 86 tankers in the Ghost Fleet that ships illicit Iranian oil have switched to carrying Russian oil instead. Half of these vessels were flagged by Panama. Should the U.S. increase pressure on Panama to deflag these vessels? A simple yes or no would be.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they should.
Yes.
That's sort of a leading question, but I appreciate the emphasis on it. How important is the Ghost Fleet to financing Russia and Iran's war machines? Ma'am, we'll start with you ladies first.
I don't have information on the importance of the Ghost Fleet to direct war efforts.
Okay.
It's indispensable. Iran has a small and very rickety fleet of tankers. Russia has very few tankers. Without those Ghost Fleet tankers, they cannot export their oil. If you take out the Ghost Fleet tankers, they're out of business.
Okay. Do you agree, sir?
Yes, and also in general, any macroeconomic lifeline.
Say that again, I'm sorry.
Yes, and in general, any macroeconomic lifeline, because the revenues generated will go towards funding the war effort.
All right. Iran sold 1 million more barrels of oil per day in March 2024 than in March of 2020. Do you feel like this administration, the Biden administration, is doing everything it can to stop the sale of U.S. sanctioned oil?
I think it's important to recognize that while there's what we can do to stop the sale of oil, there's also the fact that the Iranian regime is selling the oil very cheap, and China is willing to buy. So it's not just how we think about punishing or targeting Iranian sales, but what we can do about the purchasers. And here, because of this emerging and deepening strategic alliance between Moscow, Tehran, and Beijing, it's not just about targeting the Iranian oil sales. And I also think it's important to mention here, as we talk about oil sales and how it funds Iran or Russia's war machine, that Iranian terror is extremely cheap. They were able to continue to foment chaos, fund, train, and direct their proxies throughout the JCPOA and the maximum pressure campaign. So it is not simply about cutting off the funding. I think it's very important both for executive branch and legislative branch to think about what we can do other than just targeting the economic incentives here, given how cheap Iranian terror is.
Y'all agree with that?
Yeah, partially. If again, to go back to the cocktail, and forgive me for the analogy, if it's a martini, the macroeconomic pressure is...
I'm Southern Baptist, so I have no idea what you're talking about. Please feel free to explain.
Is Iranian terror cheap?
Iranian terror is cheap, and I'll go one further. Yes, but ballistic missiles and drones are weapons of the weak, but that doesn't mean they don't kill. So we should be in the business of macroeconomic pressure and everything else Dana just shed. It's not one or the other. And here's the quiet part out loud. Iran seldom changes its foreign and security policy. Iran has been on this collision course for 45 years under the leadership of the Islamic Republic. And so long as we treat the symptoms and not the cause, we're not going to get to the root problem here.
Iran's putting about what, 2.5 million barrels a day? Is that roughly
2.2 to 2.4, depending on estimates, and then
right. And China's buying 80% of their oil from them. Did I read that statistic right somewhere? Roughly, we're good. Yeah, I was just trying to get a ballpark. These Iranian drones they're mentioned have been used to directly attack Israel. Is there a way that the U.S. can interrupt the production?
Absolutely, and a lot of those actions are already in place and they should be tightened up. First of all, we need to shore up the air defenses of our partners. Israel has an exceptional layered air defense. We just saw our partners together operate those air defenses. Number two, we have to go after the dual use components that are ending up in Iran's drones. Number three, we have to stop and figure out how to degrade the illicit transfer of Iranian drones to the Russian theater. Number four, we need to shore up Ukraine's air defenses and their capabilities to down those drones. And five, we need to increase information and intelligence sharing between Ukraine and others who are at risk from Iranian attack drones.
Didn't we just have something that was blocking those drones, the sale of those drones, and now that they're opening that pipeline back up, so to speak? Have I read something correctly about that recently?
There is a UN embargo on sales and purchases of Iranian drones and ballistic missiles that expired in October 2023.
Right.
But that is something that can be returned.
Okay, great. I'm sorry I've gone over, Mr. Chairman. I yield nothing back to you.
And I'd like to point out, actually, with the leadership of the 435th member, legislation has passed on that issue. And so he doesn't even know how successful he is. And with that, pursuant to committee rules, all members have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length of limitation. And after Congressman Burchett, at this time, I'd like for the witnesses to stay in place, and thank goodness Congressman, the ranking member has returned, and this is amazing. But anyway, I wanted to get a picture with the witnesses in place, and so, and I was trying to have people from both parties here, and he had magically appeared. So here we are, and without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.